Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here today at World Sustainability Procurement Day, joining so many passionate and dedicated professionals committed to driving ethical and sustainable business practices. I am Anna Hakobian, Director of Sustainable Procurement and Government Compliance at AstraZeneca, focused on ethical sourcing and responsible supply chain. Today, we're diving into a critical topic, human rights risks in multi-tier supply chains. We all know that transparency is key to responsible sourcing, but visibility alone is not enough. The real challenge lies beyond visibility in mapping and prioritizing risks deep within our supply networks, where vulnerabilities often go unnoticed. So modern slavery, forced labor, and human rights abuses don't just exist in the shadows of global supply chains. They persist because they are hidden. And it's our responsibility is not just to our direct suppliers, but to the entire ecosystem that contributes to our industry. So in this session, we're going to explore how businesses can map and mitigate these risks, leveraging data-driven insights and collaborative efforts to create resilient, ethical, and sustainable supply chains. So throughout the session, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A section, and we have a Q&A session after the main presentation, and we'll address your questions. So let's get started. Before we dive deeper into today's discussion, I'm thrilled to introduce our panel of experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience in sustainable procurement, in human rights, and supply chain risk management. Joining me is Emma Howcroft, Global Sourcing Sustainability Director for Life Sciences. She's a leader in embedding sustainability into procurement strategies. And also Dirk Demers, Head of Supply Chain Risk Management at Freedom. Derek is specializing in data-driven risk analysis to uncover and address human rights risks in supply chain. So together with this excellent panelist, we're going to explore practical strategies for mapping and managing human rights risks beyond tier one suppliers, ensuring greater transparency and accountability across global supply network. Now let's get into our discussion. So to guide our discussion, today we'll cover 5 key areas. Human rights context, why addressing human rights in supply chains is a business imperative. We're going to cover how AstraZeneca and Freedom partner to map risk beyond tier one, the data-driven approaches used to uncover hidden risks, and then we're going to share with you project findings. These are key insights from our supply chain mappings, and then also actionable takeaways for building ethical and resilient supply chains. With that, let's get started with the human rights context. As we begin, I want to take a moment to reflect on why this conversation is so critical. We live in a time of unprecedented global challenges, climate disasters displacing communities, economic inequalities deepening, and vulnerable populations are just being exploited. So these crises are not distant issues. They're deeply connected to the way we do business. And to drive real innovation, we must transform how healthcare and supply chain operate, ensuring that they protect people, society, and a planet. And this is not just a philanthropy or just corporate social responsibility. This is business critical. Ensuring human rights across supply chains is a fundamental responsibility that we all share. Because at the end of the day, doing the right thing isn't just a moral obligation, it's the foundation of a sustainable and resilient future. With that in mind, let's explore the reality of human rights risks in supply chains and what we can do to change the system for the better. So businesses today operate under growing scrutiny, not just from regulators. There are so many incoming regulations, but also from customers, from investors, from employees, and society at large. So there is an increasing expectation that companies identify, prevent, and address human rights risks across their supply chains. So we all have a responsibility to ensure that we're not causing, we're not contributing, or we're not even linked to any human rights violations. But responsibility alone is not enough. We have to take an action. So this means transparency, which is understanding who is in our supply chain, risk management, identifying and mitigating risks early, policies and due diligence, embedding human rights and protection into our operations. Training is important, educating teams, educating the suppliers as well to drive the change. Remediation, it's important to address violations when they occur, and continuous improvement, because we need to measure impact and we need to adapt. It's about building a resilient, ethical, and sustainable business. Now, the life science industry plays a critical role in global health, but with that comes a high responsibility to ensure ethical sourcing and production. Many of the products that we rely on, such as active pharmaceutical ingredients, medical devices, protective equipment, they're all linked to high-risk regions where labor violations, forced labor, and exploitations are prevalent. And here are some of the facts I wanted to show you. The 30% of pharmaceutical ingredients come from regions with documented labor risks. That's huge. And then look into 25% of APIs used in US drugs, they're sourced from countries where labor violations also have been reported. 25% of global natural rubber production, essential for medical gloves and tubings, they involve forced or child labor. So the risks don't stop at raw materials, outsourced packaging, drug formulation, supply chain, labor conditions, they all contribute to the challenge. And as an industry, we must go beyond compliance and we must take proactive steps to ensure that our supply chains are indeed transparent, they're ethical and accountable also. Now, in 2023, we uncovered human rights risks in our single-use glove supply chain at AstraZeneca and highlighting a broader industry challenge. And to prevent this from happening again, we partner at AstraZeneca with one of our tier one suppliers and Freedom to proactively map and address human rights risks deep in our supply chain. And this project is a huge step towards greater transparency, towards accountability and ethical sourcing. And that's what we're going to share a lot more in today's session. Now, to effectively address human rights risks, AstraZeneca's tier one supplier took a test and learn approach, moving through 4 key phases, ensuring that we move from visibility to action in addressing human rights risks. Now, phase 1 is understanding the risk distribution, where these risks are throughout the deeper into the supply chain. We completed this phase by mapping human rights risks across our tier 1 and beyond suppliers, collecting key data and developing reports that allow engagement with suppliers, a more prioritized engagement. Phase 2 is about identifying and engaging suppliers. We're now entering this phase where we develop a risk monitoring process and start training and engaging suppliers to help them understand their risks and so that they can take action. And then next, we will move into phase 3, which is about remediation, where we work directly with suppliers to address and eliminate risks. And then phase 4 is really about embedding into business as usual, ensuring that this becomes a sustainable and repeatable process within our company. So by systemically organizing our projects, we want to ensure a meaningful progress towards ethical supply chains and also drive further transparency. Now, as we move forward, it's important to highlight the expertise behind our supply chain mapping efforts Freedom has been instrumental in helping us identify and mitigate human rights risks through data-driven insights and predictive analytics. Now, to tell us more about Freedom's role in this project and how their tools are shaping the future of supply chain risk management, I'd like to now hand it over to my colleague, to Dirk Demers, to take us from here. Dirk, to you.
Thanks, Anna. Emma's going to talk a little bit more about the results of this project, but before we get into that, I wanted to talk a bit about what Freedom is and how we extract the data that we'll be discussing. So Freedom is a supply chain risk management tool. We help our customers monitor and mitigate human rights, climate, and other ESG risks. We source information from NGOs, government entities, and third-party data aggregators. We help our customers take this intelligence and then turn it into meaningful policy and regulatory reporting. We also help clients train their employees, their suppliers, and help them build long-term strategies for transparency and compliance. So rather than just kind of go through a bunch of slides, I actually wanted to show you the platform. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to bring this up. Aha, I did it. So what does Freedom do? It takes your supplier data and it cross-references it against our database based on attributes of the supplier. So we look at a multitude of different aspects of the supplier, but generally we're looking at the countries that the supplier is located in, the industries they work in, the products that you're purchasing, and the trade relationships that these suppliers have. Now, the rest of this presentation is really about a project that's focused on the trade relationships, but I think some of this other analysis is going to be relevant both later on in the presentation and then also later on in the different phases that Anna just outlined. So I want to look specifically at how we determine product risk in particular, just because I think it's the most interesting. When we look at the products that AstraZeneca, for instance, is purchasing from its suppliers, we don't just look at the end product. Instead, we build what we call a predictive bill of materials, or a product genome, which is actually the component parts all the way back to the raw materials that make up that product. And then the risk becomes the aggregated risk of all of those subcomponents and commodities and raw materials that go up into the product. And that is how we are determining risk for products in particular. Now, when we start getting into the supply chain mapping, we're going to be talking a lot about how we are looking at the breadth of a supplier's supply chain, and it's not 100% targeted to what you're purchasing from them. Having this overlay is exactly how you would target your supply chain mapping to actually find out the most relevant sub-suppliers and sub-sub-suppliers. So that's why I think that it was important to look at it now. I have another one open just because this is Emma's favorite. Chromatography was one of the aspects that we were looking in, and as you can see here, these product genomes can get incredibly complicated as the manufacturing processes for the products that we are looking at also become more complex. And so just a really powerful way to look at products and how your supply chain actually pans out in the real world. In addition to this, Freedom is very focused on not just supplying intelligence in a vacuum. A lot of this project is about figuring out who AstraZeneca and their suppliers should be talking to about human rights issues in their supply chain. And so we don't just want to provide intelligence and not have it be acted upon. So Freedom also does supplier outreach, they do supplier engagement, they have questionnaires, things like that, so that you can reach out to your suppliers, talk to them about what's important to you, and get responses from them. I also then want to hop in and show you what supply chain mapping looks like. Emma is going to be talking a lot about supply chain mapping in the aggregate. She's going to be talking about all of the different massive numbers that we found when we walked through. And so I felt that it was relevant to show you really quickly what supply chain mapping looks like on a micro level before we hop into the larger aggregate level. What we're doing with supply chain mapping is Freedom is going out either to primary sources or secondary sources, data aggregators, things like that. And we are bringing in backing documents to show relationships between entities. Those sorts of documents are shipping manifests, customs documents, ownership records, whatever we can get our hands on in order to show that one entity is related to another. We then cross-reference that with sanctions lists, warning lists, university reports, things like that, in order to surface warnings that you may be concerned about, not just on your direct suppliers, but on their relationships. So here you can see an example supplier, all the warnings that are relevant to that particular supplier, and then you can see all of their related sub-suppliers here. You can click into this and go even deeper. Emma's gonna walk through how far we went with the rest of the project. We went to tier 5 and tier 6 in order to look for these warnings. You can see the warnings here, and then you can also even see the shipping information. So you can see the last ship date, you can see the product, and this relates to what I was just talking about with the product genome. If you can understand that not just is this entity related to your supplier, but it's also providing a subcomponent that is important to what you're purchasing, then all of a sudden this entity becomes way more relevant to you and your supply chain than if it were just a supplier that wasn't actually directly sourcing to you. Not that that is completely out of the realm of something you should be looking at, right? Even if it's an unrelated supplier to your supply chain, that can still mean that there's risk there, but the risk is much more obfuscated. All right. So now that I've walked through this, I'm going to switch back to the slides really quickly. This is the hardest part of our technical aspect. So let's see if I can do it right. See, they made me do this. I don't know why you made me do all the sharing. All right, here we go. Back to the slideshow. Let's get back to our place. All right, so this is what we just talked about, what Freedom does, the supply chain mapping, where we're pulling everything. So now I'm going to pass it on to Emma in order to talk about the project and what we're actually looking for.
Thanks, Dick. Perfect. So you've heard from Anna about why this all got going. Dick's given hopefully a nice overview of all the different tools that Freedom actually provide. And this project really looked at, as Dick mentioned, the trading relationships module that Freedom has on the system. And the purpose of really kicking this off was threefold. First of all, it was to try and uncover and quantify the human rights risks in AstraZeneca's supply chain, but specifically looking at the spend data through one tier 1 supplier. The second thing was then to organize all this data that we were finding into something more meaningful and actionable so we can actually start communicating with suppliers. And then the third thing was really to go off and actually start talking to suppliers and actually addressing where we have issues and making sure that we're actually putting remediation in place as necessary. So when we first started this, we kind of pitched the idea to AstraZeneca and we worked together to understand which tier 2 suppliers we wanted to look at, focusing on which are strategic, which have high spend, which have likely human rights risks, where are we likely to consolidate volume in the future. And we came up with a list of 149 suppliers that we wanted to target. These suppliers had your average sort of procurement related category descriptions, which was specific to their tier 1 supplier. So then it was a case of working with Freedom to make sure that our prescriptive category descriptions were then aligned to the EU standard sort of coding conventions. And the important thing of doing this, and I'll give you an example, is that if you have a supplier working in the life sciences industry, but they also have a subsidiary working in the food industry, it was essential to make sure that it was coded properly so that we were going down the life sciences industry supply chain instead of the food one, in short. So that's why the coding element was quite important. And the better we got at coding, the better the supply chain data we would get, in short. So then we put the data into Freedom, and Freedom can actually track up to, let's say, 8 to 9 levels in the supply chain. And the first thing we found when we kind of got the data back and saw this was that it was absolutely huge. And you'll see from the subsequent slides that it sort of grows exponentially as you go into the supply chain. So I think the decision at this point was that we were going to only go to supply chain level 6 and work up to this point, and perhaps in the future one day go into 7 and 8. So we decided on 6. And the key point here was, as I think Dirk alluded to before, was to use customs documentation, shipping manifests, ownership records to create the linkages between entities and who's trading with who, in essence. And then once that linkage was done, it was a case of putting various risks on top of those entities based on secondary data that's available to us, like human rights issue indices, like sanctions lists, etc. So I want to bring your attention to the diagram in the middle that looks like a kind of sideways tree. And what was really neat about Freedom's tool when we entered the data initially is that you could start to map out every single entity, in short. So what you've got here, and unfortunately I can't use my cursor at the moment, but each time you click a supplier's name, in short, the tree grows and you can see all those entities related to the supplier's name that you have clicked. And it grows and it grows and it grows. And funny enough, if you start doing this in the system, it becomes absolutely huge. So we started to think, how do we need to break down this data so it's easier to read? So one thing came up, which was, I would say, definitive risks versus relational risks, let's call them. So a definitive risk is where we found that that entity in the supply chain had a human rights or another risk factor associated with it. And this was a definitive known fact. And then because other suppliers or entities in the supply chain, sorry, if you can stay on that side for a while,
Oh,
that would be great. Yeah. Because other suppliers in the supply chain are linked to it, you then have, as you can see on the screen, reds and ambers because of that relational linkage. But we were keen, I should say, to make sure that we were getting the definitive risk. So that was one of the learnings that we had from this project. So it was, how do we make sure we get to the definitive risk? The second learning, and this is where we go to the tree analogy, and you can see the kind of picture in the bottom left, was that what we were really uncovering was the entire supply chain. And one of the things we need to be really clear on when we're uncovering this is we really want our product branches. So we want to know not necessarily the suppliers in our supply chain, but those suppliers that are providing the exact product that's going into our sort of end products in the end, or raw materials going into our end products. So if I give you an example, so imagine you're looking at one of these suppliers on the end here, you might have one sort of providing, or you might have the same supplier providing a cotton lab coat, and you might have that same supplier providing nitrile gloves, as an example. AstraZeneca may be buying the nitrile gloves that doesn't have a human rights risk associated with it, but the cotton lab coat does because it's in the Xinjiang province or made or manufactured there, as an example. So what this shows us is what I like to refer to as the indirect supply chain tree. But what it doesn't necessarily provide us with is the specific data to say that that product isn't associated with the human rights and this product is. And that's like a second phase that we need to go on to, but it's worth noting that when sort of going through the data. So when we put all the data in, and we crunched all 149 suppliers and all their spend data and category data, what we found out is we could map relationships for about 72% of the data that we had, which is fantastic. But it means that 28% couldn't be mapped. And Dirk will come on to talk a little bit about that afterwards. But what it allowed us to do, mapping out our indirect supply tree, is to find 570 entities with a known risk up to 6 levels in our supply chain, which was pretty impressive, I thought. If we go on to the next slide. Thanks. And then what we were then able to do when we started to look at where were these at-risk entities appearing in the supply chain we could start to see at what point they were appearing. And you can see the exponential growth here as you go through the tiers. And interestingly, if you go into tiers 7, 8, and 9, which I've just mentioned, it tends to get bigger and bigger, and it starts to become quite unmanageable, the amount of data you've got. But interestingly, with the kind of changes to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which now states that you don't technically have to map out your supply chain unless you have a risk, that would suggest that if companies, for example, are mapping out their tier 1 and tier 2, it's quite likely, as in our project, that no risk will show up. But that doesn't mean that there aren't potential human rights risks in their supply chain. And that's why a tool like this is so important, and why this particular project is important, because it actually shows that, in actual fact, human rights issues are potentially deeply buried in your supply chain. And that's why supply chain mapping activity and tools like this are so important. Thanks, Dirk. So if I just guide you now to the various risk indicators on the right there, you can see very quickly, and you've got a mixture here. So we went with human rights indicators, but what we also did is included your standard kind of ABAC indicators as well, because we thought they were quite interesting. So you kind of got a mix of two, I would say. But you can see from the human rights ones that they actually only start in tier 4. You can also see that the second largest sort of risk indicator is sanctioned entities. And what I found really interesting about this is that I think ABAC indicators have been used by procurement for, like, I'd say, decades now. So I thought it was quite interesting to see that still being quite high, despite us having ABAC practices in place for many years. And obviously, I'd say sustainability and human rights is starting to get bigger with regulation as we come on board. The next sort of bit that's worth pointing out here as well, if you look at the sort of human rights ones with little people next to them, is that there are a lot of references to the Xinjiang region here. And it is worth pointing this out. So the Xinjiang region falls under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, in short. And interestingly enough, this act, unlike most kind of judicial principles, doesn't assume innocent until proven guilty. It assumes you're guilty until proven innocent, which means that anyone that's actually buying or manufacturing from the Xinjiang region is now assumed to have forced labor. And it is a geographical sort of constraint, in short. So it's a much easier indicator, I would say, to actually put into the system and sort of analyze data on, which is why it appears quite a lot here. And because it is associated with the regulation, it's obviously more important as well. Can we press on? Thank you. So this is probably my favorite slide, because once we sort of crunched all the numbers and started to look at where we had at-risk entities and where we had risks in the supply chain, it became clear that out of the 149, 8 of our suppliers actually made up the majority of the risk, in short. So 89% of the at-risk entities we found in the supply chain actually sat within 8 supplier supply chain only, and 95% of all the risks identified also sat with those 8 suppliers as well. And the reason why it's quite high is because often you'd have multiple risks associated with, let's say, one entity as an example. But what this immediately allows us to do is to actually prioritize who we go and speak to. So initially, 149 suppliers for any procurement person would sound quite a high number of people to engage with. 8 suppliers is far more feasible, and it actually helps with allocation of resources, which again is why these types of tools are so important. If you can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So because we started this project looking at human rights only, I thought it would be helpful to put this slide in, which shows you the count of entities, but just focusing on the human rights risk. So this is taking out the ABAC ones. So if you're a procurement professional looking at this, interestingly enough, you can see immediately that your human rights risks start at tier 4, which in itself is interesting data. you can see that it still exponentially grows significantly when it gets to tier 6. And what you can also see if you wanted to prioritize further is that you could just work with suppliers 1, 2, and 3 and get the majority of your risks. Or if you're the sustainable sourcing person in your team, you could potentially pilot with supplier 6, which has the smallest amount of risks. And then once you're comfortable with the processes that you want to put in place, then sort of get your category or procurement managers to then have conversations with suppliers 1, 2, and 3 and prioritize that way. If we just go on to the next slide, thanks, Dick. So here I thought it would be helpful, still sticking with human rights risks, dividing them between those human rights risks that are associated with Xinjiang and those that aren't. And the reason I think it's important is that you're basically contravening the UFLPA if you're not actually looking into these risks and actually making sure that they're not indirect risks. Sorry, making sure that they are indirect risks and they're not actually part of your product branch in your supply chain, because you have a requirement to make sure they are not in your supply chain, in your product branch, in short. So I think looking at the data this way is quite helpful in understanding if you're even meeting relevant regulations. Thanks, Dick. So this is quite an interesting slide because unlike previous slides where we have been able to sort of specify where the risk is, what we found with sort of geographical coverage is we weren't necessarily always able to find the entity's country. So I would never look at this to find sort of specificity in association to risks. But what this does help show, in my view, is that a lot of the suppliers that we're dealing with also have offices and manufacturing sites in different countries and not necessarily the country where the risk is at. And I can show you on the next slide an example of this. But the benefit of this, if you see Americas and, for example, or North America, I should say, and Europe has quite big blobs, that shows that a lot of offices and manufacturing sites are also shared, are also based in Europe and North America, where these regulations tend to be required by law. So if you're sort of engaging with your supply chain, it's actually quite helpful the fact that they have these offices and manufacturing sites in other countries where these regulations are required, because then it'll be easier when you're engaging with your suppliers to actually have conversations. And I think that's what this geographical spread sort of shows. And I think Dirk explained it really well to me. So I'll try and do him justice here. So in North America, for example, you have a lot more entities with fewer risks, but the size of the blob is really linked to the number of entities that just happen to be based in the US. Whereas in China, for example, there are fewer entities, but they have greater number of risks, and that's what's made the blob sort of redder and greater there. And it's probably 4 times the number of risks in China than you get in the US, as an example. So it's good to sort of interrogate the data and understand why you have these nuances around the globe and what it can mean when communicating to your procurement team. We just go on to the next slide. So we had a bit of a debate here as to whether to include this or not. So this is, and it was picked at complete random. I'm just going to say this isn't even the best, let's say, row. We literally picked it at random. But this is one of the rows in, let's say, the raw data that we've kind of transposed here so you can kind of see what it looks like. And I just wanted to talk you through it. So you get your internal ID, which is up to you. You have your supplier's name, which is obviously so you can recognize who they are. You can put all sorts of different category, not category, but let's say KPIs that you want to measure in the system. So we wanted to be able to tag that they had a human rights risk. We wanted to tag that they were strategic. There were other tags in here, but we took them out. And then you have the entity at risk's name. So this is like Joe Blogs in short. And then you have the tier where that entity appears. And this is really important for, let's say, pivoting, for like pivot tables and so forth. If you actually want to like quickly like create reports offline as an example. For the product flow path, this sometimes appeared, sometimes didn't appear, but it's helpful because it immediately tells you, are these the sorts of things that I'm buying from your supplier and where you potentially have gaps in data. The risk flow path beneath that are all the risks associated with the different entities in that supply chain. And you kind of have lines like that that sort of show you the different risks. And then you have an arrow that actually then takes you onto the next entity's set of risks, in short. The one thing I would say about this box is that it has both relational and sort of definitive risks in them. And the most important box is risk type. And this is really the risk for your definitive entity that has a risk, in short. And interestingly, in this example, what it's saying is you have a human rights risk, you have a potential Xinjiang risk as well, and you also have a state owned enterprise risk. So you've got a like triple whammy there all in one go. And this is happening fourth level in the supply chain. When you look at the country flow path, what they're trying to do is to show you all the countries that are associated with that company in its flow. And what it's actually showing in the final line are all the countries that are associated with that entity which is at risk. Now, interestingly enough, I don't see the acronym for China, but I do see the acronym for Hong Kong. And I know there's a Xinjiang issue. So it's quite interesting when you start to unpick the data, why to start asking why things are happening. And this data is helpful if you need to go back to your supplier. And quite frankly, and if I just go to the one that says supply chain path, for me, that's the most important one because I can actually immediately say to my supplier, you've got this person in the supply chain who's selling to this person, who's selling to this person, who's selling to you. And we know what the risk is definitively, and we know potentially what they're buying from you. And then you can have a really meaningful conversation with your suppliers. So that's where I thought it gets really interesting. So next slide, and then and this is why I pass off to Dick. But if you remember, I said we didn't have data for 28% of the relationships that we wanted to map. And so Dick's going to talk to you about what other great tools we can use to sort of close that gap, in short.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Obviously, the supply chain mapping and the deep dive into the paths is very cool, but we felt that it would be uh, important to talk about the 30% that we did not find relationships for. And one of my favorite phrases is always that the absence of evidence isn't the evidence of absence, right? Just because we couldn't find problems, because we couldn't find that relational data, doesn't mean that there aren't issues in those entities' supply chains. And so I wanted to highlight very quickly, and this goes back to the product walkthrough that we did a moment ago, the importance of predictive risk analysis in addition to the direct evidentiary risk analysis that we're doing with the supply chain mapping. So I did a quick analysis of the 30% of entities that we did not focus on for this project. 70% of them were were operating in high risk industries. 50% source products at risk for conflict mineral issues, and 42% worked in sectors flagged by modern slavery legislation. So what that tells you is we weren't able to find, a customs document or a shipping manifest that mapped to another entity, but these entities still potentially have high risk issues, and so they shouldn't be ignored. And so using the predictive analysis in addition to the mapping is how you can make sure that you fill those gaps and you can take reasonable measures in order to talk with these entities. And then I also did want to say, and Emma brought this up as she was talking about our methodology and what we were aiming to do, that AstraZeneca and their suppliers looked at a really specific subset of risks, right? And we just wanted to mention that there are a ton of other risks out there, and every company is looking at risk differently. And so we just wanted to mention very quickly that we were looking at a very filtered, very targeted subsection of the potential pitfalls that are out there when you're looking at supply chains and when you're trying to analyze this risk. And so I just didn't want to leave today without saying, very quickly that we are looking at these things based on what AstraZeneca and their suppliers' business focus was. And everyone else's business focus may be a little bit different. So if you didn't see things in there that maybe you think are very key to your business, or if there are things in there that you say, oh, that's actually not something that we would be worried about, that's okay. Everyone should be looking at this through the lens of their own business and their own deliverables. So with that, I'm now going to pass it back to Anna so that she can talk about what the next steps are.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Dirk, for walking us through the deeper complexities of human rights risk mapping through deeper tiers. So one of the most critical aspects of this process is engaging suppliers, because without their transparency and cooperation, even the most advanced risk mapping won't lead to real change. So we need suppliers to validate the risks that we have identified. We need them to take ownership and implement corrective actions. And now, as we move forward, we face a critical next step, which is isolating which entities are connected to our product-related supply chain. So we have identified risks, we've prioritized key suppliers, but now we must determine, are these at-risk entities directly linked to what AstraZeneca is buying? And if not, how far do we extend our due diligence upstream? This is where our decisions will define the impact. And it's a very important to have that next step and to further prioritization and focus. Now, as we go to the next slide, while we focus on our own project, it's important to step back and look at the broader best practices that any organization can apply to strengthen human rights due diligence in their supply chains. Let's explore some of the key strategies that can help drive meaningful action. As we all work towards more ethical and more transparent supply chain, there are core best practices that can be applied across industries to strengthen the human rights due diligence. First, identify, assess, and prioritize. And the first step is really understanding where the risks are and which issues need urgent attention based on severity and impact. And that's what we were doing with this project, also identifying where those risks are, where we're going to prioritize our efforts. The second is integrate and act. So due diligence isn't effective if it is separated and it's separate from our daily operations, right? It must be embedded into procurement, into sourcing and risk management process so that action is immediate when red flags appear. And then address more preventing and mitigating. Once risks are identified, the focus should be on long-term solutions, not just short-term fixes, which is still important to fix short-term, but we have to be looking long-term. And prevention strategies like supplier capability building, audits, and remediation programs, they are key. There was a question in the chat about the trainings. As we're talking about training, maybe I'll just address that. The question was whether the trainings are being done for management personnel of suppliers and would be good to have for workers. Well, while training management is a crucial step, workers must be included in any human rights training effort. So I highly recommend to ensure that the entire organization is being trained, the entire supply chain is aligned with ethical standards. So training for workers should focus not only on raising awareness about their rights, but also how they can also proactively be engaged, report violations, and seek help if needed. So thank you for the question. But yes, absolutely, that's what we do in AstraZeneca as well. When we do the training, we train the company-wide personnel. Next, tracking and communication, right? Communicating progress. So transparency matters, right? Continuously monitoring risks, sharing updates, and holding stakeholders accountable ensures due diligence isn't just a one-time exercise, but it's an ongoing commitment, because unless we embed that into our organization in ongoing, like continuous efforts, this is not going to be sustainable. So these best practices can help any organization move beyond compliance and create a real lasting impact on supply chain ethics. Now, as we reflect on our journey so far, here are some of the key lessons that we've learned from this process that I wanted to share with you. The first is the need for targeting mapping. So supply chains are vast and risks don't stop at tier one. As you can see, we have been seeing a lot more risk coming as we move to tier 4, tier 5, tier 6. So we need to track entity connections deeper to get a complete picture. Then massive data volume. Our initial mapping surfaced about over like 300,000 entities and 1 million relationships. And it's very overwhelming, but to avoid being overwhelmed, we had to refine our scope to focus on actionable insights. Then supply chains are fast and they're interconnected. Risks don't exist in silos. So a narrow approach won't work. Instead, we need to have a smart prioritization to make the meaningful progress. Next, key suppliers drive risk. Then the highest risk connections often concentrate in a few suppliers. As you could see, even though we looked into like huge number of suppliers, then the biggest amount of risks were concentrated on 8 suppliers. So focusing on these critical players, well, first identifying and then focusing on them can significantly reduce the workload while maximizing the impact. And then collaboration is key. Engaging suppliers isn't optional, it's essential. Like in this exercise, we engaged our tier 1 suppliers, and together we have been collaborating and thinking how we can best address and who can help us with this project. That's where the freedom came into a play. So working with them instead of against them is the only way to create sustainable change. Then discovery is an action. Right, many companies hesitate to look deeper, and they're fearing what they will find. But identifying risk is a step forward, not a setback. And transparency leads to solutions. So these insights are shaping how we move forward, not just at AstraZeneca, but across industries to build a more responsible supply chain. Now, to close, as we've seen throughout this session, mapping human rights risks in supply chain is complex, but it's necessary. We've learned that targeted mapping, collaboration, and supplier engagements are critical to making real progress. And the sheer scale of the challenge can feel overwhelming, but discovery itself is an action, and every step towards transparency brings us closer to meaningful change. So don't think about this as compliance. It's really about responsibility, resilience, and doing what's right. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being on this session, for your engagement, and we see some questions coming in Q&A and chat, and also thank our panelists, Dirk and Emma, to share their insight. And let's now open the floor for your questions and for discussion.
Shall we read them out then? So I think from Peter, he says, not sure he's understanding it. There were 149 priority tier 2 suppliers within one tier 1 supplier supply chain. Seems extraordinary. So no, there's not just 149 priority suppliers in the tier 1 supplier supply chain. The 149 suppliers were AstraZeneca's chosen suppliers that they wanted to go for. So AstraZeneca chose which tier 2 suppliers they wanted to prioritize as part of this project. So they made that choice based on who they felt was strategic. So it meant that the tier 1 supplier had to share data with AstraZeneca so that they could then pick those suppliers and say, these are the ones we want to sort of continue with. Does that make sense? I'm going to hope so. And then, at what stage of the risk assessment, this is Andrea, do you engage with the supplier? Um, I'd say now. Once you've got your data.
But I will say to that point, there are some people out there where engagement is the first step, right? Where they say, hey, look, just go out and send questionnaires to all of your suppliers. And we find that that isn't super helpful. You get very low response rate. You don't, it's not very targeted. It takes a lot of bandwidth. And so the whole point of this is to Emma's point, get the data in first, get the sort of lower level, the lower number of suppliers that you want to target, and then go from there.
And also the engagement is not just for this project, right? If you look much in a broader sense, you need to engage your suppliers to drive sustainability, whether it's environmental sustainability, whether it's social sustainability, whether to ensure that they have the right policies and processes and action in place. I would say just if you haven't engaged yet, start engaging also in overall sharing what your priorities are in regards to sustainabilities, because that can naturally link into more further exercise, something like this, where you can map your risk for human rights as well. I see there was one question about why we chose freedom. Maybe I'll just address that, and Emma, if you can add anything. So we chose freedom because they had got the right tools in place that could help us to dig further into our supply chain, and also their application offers a user-friendly platform that help organizations track and address human rights risk effectively. So that was going to help us to increase transparency, to better understand and get an insight into some of the deep dive details as we move into like tier 4 and 5 and 6. And that's why we chose the freedom. So Emma, if you want to add anything beyond what I shared, would be great.
Yeah, I think that the genomes and trading relationships and really the trading relationships platform was what excited us at first. And then I would say just their willingness to learn and work with you to keep innovating and finding better ways to do this, which I don't think you get across all providers really. I'm going to carry on down the list because Andrew's asked, if you're a consultant, data provider, or other service provider, how do you make the business case to do this type of analysis?
So I can maybe, okay, go ahead, Dirk.
Oh, sorry. So a term that we talked about when we were brainstorming this, but it didn't end up getting into the final presentation, was supply chain transparency is supply chain security. So while we're looking at this from a human rights lens, if you want to look at it from a business standpoint, if a supplier has a human rights issue or other warning and they can no longer import into a country that you need them to import into, that's a problem. That's going to cause revenue interruption. That's going to cause production interruption. And so understanding this, it's great from a value perspective, from a values perspective, but it's also great from a value perspective in terms of understanding where the risk is and where you might have interruptions.
Yeah, and thank you, dear. To add to that, I would say also depending which regions you're operating, what type of consulting and which areas you cover, but I would suggest you first to the materiality assessment to see what you do, where the impact is the most. And I'm sure as a consulting company, you're going to have the human rights coming as actually high from the weight perspective. But then to make the business case for something like this, or for adopting a tool like Freedom application and deep diving, I think it's important to look into risk mitigation and compliance component. You can also bring some of the legal and regulatory compliance area, emphasizing that the human rights violations in supply chain, they can lead to severe legal consequences. And another thing is avoiding supply chain disruption and the operations of your company disruption. You can also, and I shared earlier, like brand reputation and consumer trust. You can bring some of the areas that are important because there is a demand and need from consumers also in regards to transparency. In the long term, cost saving also, because it prevents the hidden cost, improves operational efficiency, and then just to end the employee and worker well-being as well. And with all of that, you can just summarize it as the long-term competitive advantage, because you do this exercise, you're going to make your company more sustainable and more desirable place to work for employees, but also for other companies to partner with you.
Yeah, and Caitlin, just before you interrupt, I'm going to answer one quick question for them, because they've asked, how do you collaborate with your suppliers, whether it's tier 1, 2, or 3, or 4, 5? I don't think we're quite there in the project to provide guidance and advice yet, because we're kind of going into that part of the project more. So hopefully Anna and Dirk will have more to tell you next year. Would be my answer to that one.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm afraid we do need to wrap up as we're out of time. So thank you everybody for joining this session. I am just going to put a quick screen up for you to share your feedback on the session. And then of course we will play a video and resume with our content as normal. So thank you so much. And thank you, Anna, Dirk, and Emma.
Thanks, folks.
Hello everyone. So I've been with the SPP for almost 3 years now, maybe just a little more than that. And last couple of years working as a co-chair with the public procurement chapter. It's been a fantastic experience, really, really good. Because we've done a number of things over the years in terms of uplifting the information, the knowledge about public procurement, working with a diverse set of countries, or trying to understand all the ins and outs of what's going on in their parts of the world with respect to public procurement. But more so, it's not just the public procurement side, which is obviously the subject I'm interested in. It's the overarching message from the SPP, which is about sustainable procurement, which personally I think is a very strong tool to help the global economies meet their sustainability targets, ESG targets. And yeah, the idea is to just continue working with SPP, supporting SPP's agenda much as we can, especially at trying to uplift things here in the GCC and the UAE. And all the best to SPP.